moon, is it Io? One of the moons of Jupiter, I believe, has these amazing, and our satellites have photographed these things, but there are these amazing mineral formations, you know, that are growing. It's just spectacular landscape on the surface of this moon, right? But there's no life there. And theoretically, some of those minerals could be very valuable. And at some point, humans might try to exploit them, right? And an environmental ethicist might say, well, wait a minute now, you know, though that moon and those mineral formations have intrinsic value. And even though we can't see them with the naked eye, you know, they have value and should not be interfered with. So what would Rolston present? I don't know if Rolston would make an argument like that, but I guess you could. What is storied achievement, right? Is storied achievement manifest in crystals? Maybe, I don't know. But, okay, deontological ecocentrism. This is the categorical imperative, right? That the resource manager follows if he accepts this position of deontological ecocentrism. Treat the value-generating capacities of nature always as ends and never solely as means. Okay? Natural systems exhibit storied achievement. Anything which exhibits storied achievement. So right now we're filling in that magic box of stuff that we know we can't instrumentalize. Or, excuse me, we can instrumentalize, right? No worries there. We can instrumentalize all kinds of stuff, whether it's in the box or not. But we can't reduce it all the way. That's the difference, right? You can't reduce it all the way. And if you know that harming the integrity is a reductive act, then, oops, you can't do that either, right? So it could be a very stringent demand that this rule places upon us, right? And there are these storied achievements manifesting themselves all over the place. And so we have obligations, Rolston would say, at every level to protect and preserve the value-generating capacities of nature. Okay? And here's my little note about anthropogenic. And by the way, that Rolston, I think it's Rolston that uses this term, light in the refrigerator theory of intrinsic value, and he means it as a pejorative term. This is Rolston's rebuttal to Collicutt. He's saying, Collicutt, your theory is weak because it's like a light in the refrigerator theory and it doesn't make any sense. You want to talk about inherent values, right? He does want to talk about lights and what's in the refrigerator, the ecosystems, right? The ecological holes. We keep them in the refrigerator, right? Anyway, that's what's in there, right? But Collicutt wants to say that somehow the light's there, but it's not really on until humans open it. But it's there all along too, right? Collicutt kind of wants to have the best of both worlds. Rolston just comes along and says, that's preposterous. You can't have it both ways. And my theory, which insists, right, but which takes us away from Darwinism, right? That's the key point too. Keep all this in mind. Rolston can no longer be called a Darwinist because he's no longer a consequentialist. Okay? Collicutt still, and that's why Collicutt wants to be a Darwinist. He insists, he loves Darwin, and he is convinced by his own reading of the land ethic that the land ethic is written on Darwinian roots, right? Even though in the land ethic in other parts of the Sand County Almanac, Leopold does use the name Darwin, and obviously Leopold did appreciate Darwin a great deal. But in the land ethic itself, in that final chapter, he never mentions Darwin, not even once. So, maybe Collicutt's just off base on that. But because Collicutt insists that Leopold is a consequentialist and that the land ethic must be a consequentialist ethic, then that's where he falls into, according to Rolston, right? That's the trap that he falls into, this trap of not being able to give a coherent account of how an ecological whole can be independently, right? Independently and directly morally considerable, right? And so, right? And ultimately, Collicutt's theory is relativistic, according to Rolston, right? If the culture that you live in has not yet made the connections that turn the light on in the refrigerator, guess who makes those connections? Ecologists, right, and biologists. They're the ones who make all the cultural connections, right, and then they share that with people and we grow as a culture into an ecologically informed culture, right, and at that point we start attributing intrinsic status or inherent status to equal, and at that point we give them rights and we start treating them as respectfully by law, right, all that. That's Collicutt's reading, right? Anyway, and it's all built out of an appreciation of long-term consequences that ecologists teach us about, right? And teaching us about those long-term consequences turns the light on in the refrigerator, right? But we need humans. We need those teachings. Otherwise, the light never turns on. Ralston says, screw that. Get rid of the dam. We're just going to shatter it. It's all, the whole refrigerator's broken. We're going to throw it out the window, right? Along with our TVs and all of our other junk. And we're just going to accept what is the truth, according to Ralston. Namely, that values are being objectively generated at all these different levels, all the time. Because values are a reflection of storied achievement. Okay? Anyway, and now we've come across this defense of species and of wilderness, and in general of a harmonious relationship with land, air, water, wildlife. That we find, right? We find the same kind of vigorous defense that we find in a guy like John Muir. Now, fully developed in a secular form, right? In a non-religious, secular form, right? Through Ralston. Even though, you can always look kind of behind his background and see, aha, he's really been a Presbyterian minister the whole time, and he's kind of sneaking in these metaphysical assumptions, which would be what the Neo-Humean would accuse Ralston of doing, sneaking in these metaphysical assumptions impermissibly and unacceptably, right? That would be Norton's response, for example, to Ralston. But, summing it up here, this neo-Kantian deontological ecocentrism is a rule-based, right? I think we've already been all over this. Ralston's version of the categorical imperative, again, just another formulation of it. So now this is a very clear, crystal clear, of course the devil's in the details, but it gives us a fairly clear guideline to how we should manage our natural resources. Right? This is the measurement of the moral rightness, moral wrongness of a resource decision, whether or not it takes care to avoid treating ecological wholes as mere means to human ends. Okay? And this can be devastating, right? I mean, if science teaches us that just a few more particles of junk into the atmosphere, and it's lights out for the atmosphere, then, then we got to stop completely, right? I mean, this is a very stringent test. Although it's predicated on science. Maybe science hasn't advanced enough to give us that kind of information. So, that's what the energy companies, of course, they exploit uncertainty, right? Science never can tell exactly what action is going to harm the integrity of an ecological whole, right? To the breaking point. Science can't tell us that. So we have to make a rough guess, right? And then the lawyers for the energy companies stand up in court and say, Your Honor, a rough guess isn't good enough. We need to have certainty here, and there is no certainty. So you must let us continue. Right? And because we don't operate on the precautionary principle, the way a lot of European countries, I believe the European Union, right? Over there, an action has to be demonstrated to not harm human beings before it will be approved. Right? A new food chemical in the food or something like that. Whereas here, it won't be prohibited until it's been demonstrated that it harms human beings. So that's why I mentioned, it's one reason why we're in the middle of this huge chemistry experiment, right? Because nobody's taken the time to show the connections between cancers and autism and all these horrible modern afflictions that we have and all these chemicals that we're subjected and bombarded with on a daily basis. Anyway. But yeah, the earth is fragile. Ecologists are teaching us more and more. Our decisions are going to have to be consistent with this categorical imperative. Our actions are going to have to be a lot more sensitive. Probably. This is a very stringent. This is probably the most stringent of all. I mean, this is meta-ethically, right, all the way, right? You could say Norton is kind of a radical environmentalist, policy-wise. E.O. Wilson is a radical environmentalist policy-wise. But a deep ecologist would say these guys are still shallow ecologists because they haven't taken the step of radicalizing their metaphysics. Okay? They're still accepting these structures of morality. They're still accepting this imperial project, for example, of identifying moral status. For those of you who are a little bit fed up with all this moral status business and this, in a way we've been doing, much of what we've done in this meta-ethical journey we've been on the last 3 weeks or so is analytic philosophy, really. And analytic philosophy is not my cup of tea. I'm much more into socially and politically engaged philosophy. And analytic philosophy is this tradition that comes primarily out of England that kind of took over Western universities' departments of philosophy, not at least in the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and of course England, England, Scotland. The analytic philosophers kind of took over philosophy departments, and their main focus is the clarifying the meaning of terms, right? And that's kind of what we've been doing, right? When we do metaethics, the way we've been doing metaethics, we've really been clarifying the meaning of our key terms, right? Clarifying the meaning of intrinsic value, for example. Clarifying the meaning of obligation, right? So we've had to do work that really is something that is taken up primarily by analytic philosophers. And now when we get to Thomas Birch, though, Thomas Birch will begin to identify that tradition of that tradition of seeking out moral status in things. That goes hand in hand with the tradition of preserving wilderness too, and the tradition of preserving species, both of which are good traditions. Okay? Tom Birch is a very dedicated, passionate environmentalist, so probably could easily be characterized as a radical environmentalist, probably characterizes himself as a radical environmentalist. But he's very skeptical of wilderness preservation as a standalone policy goal. He's very skeptical of species preservation as a standalone policy goal, and he's very skeptical philosophically of the project of identifying moral status. He thinks this project of identifying moral status, even in this generous, very liberal, progressive form that environmentalists take, right, which is good, right? He thinks it's good that we have national parks, but he thinks that it tends to emphasize the metaphysical problems that undergird and the separateness of humans from nature. Okay, when the project of trying to identify moral status is one that perpetuates the separation of humans from nature, and so we need to stop doing that too. And Thomas Birch is one that says that potentially anything has moral status. If we start thinking, if we want to talk about what has moral status, then we have to say everything has moral status. And that's also a claim that the environmental pragmatists would make too. And actually, we'll get into some environmental pragmatism later today in this class, and then we'll get a lot more into it next week, because I read Thomas Birch as, if not an environmental pragmatist, if not coming from that tradition, at least perfectly compatible with that tradition. And his analysis of the nature of value, I think, resonates very, very well with what the pragmatists are saying about the nature of value. So for those of you who have been got a little bit tired of this heavy meta-ethics, finally you can rest easy now. And I think the Thomas Birch essay you'll find is easier to read, and some of the points he makes are refreshing after all this heavy-duty ivory tower metaphysics. All right. So, not sure where we want to leave off here, but we've got a whole bunch more, obviously, to. Oh my goodness. Yeah, I think we'll just. What should we do here? So note that Rolston needs mediation principles in some of his other books. All these philosophers realize this, right? And we're just getting a snippet of each philosopher. But Rolston's project in the essay that I asked you to read is to defend prima facie duties to species. Very, very strong, right? He does recognize that in some instances, a genetic lineage is going to have to take a back seat to some kind of human concerns, right? There are rare situations where Rolston would agree that perhaps the species needs to be sacrificed, right? But for the most part, obviously he wants to defend the claim that we have prima facie duties to defend species. But anyway, if you're looking for some kind of mediation principles, or if you want to accuse Rolston of just being this dogmatic, radical environmentalist who doesn't, then you need to read some of his other work. And he does have guidelines. And actually, he's become much more of a social ecologist. You don't know what that means yet because we haven't studied social ecology yet. But in the last 20, 25 years or so, since the 90s, really, Rolston has been writing a lot of work and doing work with the United Nations, actually. And he's taken up a lot of social concerns that he had not paid very much attention to early in his career. And that's made him more of a social ecologist. coming from a fairly left-wing point of view, as far as I can tell, a left-wing point of view that's strong, right, that supports strong United Nations action on behalf of both impoverished people and endangered ecosystems and biodiversity. But he's had to get his hands dirty, you know, in trying to deal with social issues. What we read was from a much earlier phase of his work, in the 80s, I think. You know, it's not very well developed. Anyway, you know, pay attention with both Schweitzer, with these objectivists, okay? These meta-ethical objectivists might be committing a naturalistic fallacy, all right? So whenever you read, whenever you contemplate, look, I'm telling you that both Rolston and Schweitzer believe and insist that some facts in nature are value facts. Remember? Schweitzer says it's a value fact that every individual living being is a teleological center of life. Okay? And then he builds up this whole objective structure of duties out of these value facts, right? And Rolston does the same thing. And when you find philosophers making this kind of argument, right, it's a deontological argument, but it's one that relies on this teleological reading of entities in nature. And you might be skeptical of that reading of entities in nature as being teleological, right? It's one of those claims where, you know, God, how do you resolve that? It makes sense. It seems, you know, a lot of people swing with that. You know, sure. But then there's an easy out for the white-coated economist, you know, the clinical guy who just wants to talk about what's factual, right? There's an easy out. Say, what do you mean, man? There aren't any values here. There's just facts. It's just stuff. It's just facts, mathematics and facts. It's all there is. There's no value. You're bringing that all in, right? Rolston says, no, I'm not bringing it in. It's objectively there. There are value facts objectively there. So we have to ask, is he perhaps committing some kind of naturalistic fallacy? Just a reminder, what is a naturalistic fallacy? It's any attempt to predicate a moral argument on an empirical claim about nature. Okay? So natural law theorists are most guilty, especially in the obvious example. I don't like, you know, coming up with vulgar examples from the bedroom and stuff like that in an environmental ethics class, but it's just so easy to explain what I mean. You know, I'll give an example of that. For example, a claim that you often hear is that marriage is supposed to be between a man and a woman because the nature of marriage is such and such, right? An empirical claim about the nature of marriage. And so they base some cultural conservatives will base an argument against marriage equality on a fallacy. They make this fallacious move, right? They move from an empirical claim about the nature of marriage to a moral claim about what ought to happen, right? So that, you know, and then again, this is a move that after Darwin we all become extremely skeptical of, right? And the natural law theorists kind of get driven out of the university and they take refuge in the church, right? So we need to be skeptical, though. Maybe some of these academic philosophers, you know, are kind of masquerading around over here, and they're committing a naturalistic fallacy, and they're kind of trying to sneak it past us, right? What's this business about nature, about evolutionary history being teleological, you know, and therefore generating value? And, you know, how do you know that? Anyway, these are questionable metaphysical. Let's just sum it all up, okay? There are some questionable metaphysical commitments that are wrapped up in this insistence about value facts in nature. Okay? But these are the kind of claims that Rolston makes, right? And what I asked you to read. A species runs a telic course, right? It has fingers and toes. It's adapting, generation after generation, getting more and more adapted to its home, right? It runs a telic course through its environment and through time, defending a particular form of life. Moral claims are being made. There's somebody there. There's somebody there in that strand of genetic lineage, in that strand of evolutionary history. There is an entity there that has moral status, right? Because it's running this telic course and it's defending a particular form of life across the generations, right? Of course, Rolston would say the same thing about a community of humans, you know, some endangered tribe in the Amazon. Not just the individual humans there, but the tribe itself, with its language, with its history, with its continuity. It's run a telic course through its environment. The tribe has, right? Well, Italians say that all the time, right? Scottish people say that all the time, right? Edinburgh, Scotland, you know, the Athens of the North, and they're all proud, right? They would be shocked if somebody said, well, Edinburgh has no value whatsoever, right? It's only the individual people there that have value. No, you want to say Edinburgh has run this telic course through history, and it's a magnificent thing, you know. You should be in awe of that, and you should recognize that Edinburgh itself has moral status. Not just the people there, but the community has moral status. Anyway, that's what Rolston wants to say about a species. Okay? An ecosystem generates a spontaneous order that envelops and produces the integrity, stability, and beauty of its biotic communities. Okay, spontaneous order. I could have used the word autopoietic again. It comes up later on, so if you want to know how to spell it, it's on one of these other pages of notes, I think. Anyway, and then Rolston concludes by saying that those who refuse to accept such value facts what they're doing, they're committing a subjectivistic fallacy, right? Or an anthropocentric fallacy. Anthropocentrist fallacy. So he kind of turns the tables, right? We've been over this already, that biocentrism has a critique of ecocentrism. Some biocentrists think it's a lot easier to recognize teleological properties in individual organisms. I mean, that's recognizable, whereas what Rolston is saying is not really recognizable, right? The idea that an ecological whole has teleological properties is something that a biocentrist is going to be skeptical of. And remember again, it might not be possible to at the same time be an ecocentrist and a biocentrist, right? Because the biocentrist goal is to maximize life, longevity, health for every individual organism in that biotic community, right? That means all the deer, all the blades of grass, all the trees, all the elk, all the wolves have to all be healthy and grow old and die of old age, right? And of course, that's totally incompatible. That's never going to happen, right? And ecocentrist recognizes this. So you have to choose. You have to be one or the other, perhaps, at least at the same time, right? I mean, you could be a biocentrist when you analyze the orca population in Puget Sound, for example, right? And you could also be an ecocentrist. Both arguments work quite well there. Whereas if you're trying to defend, for example, the integrity of an ecosystem, of a place like Mineral King, for example, then you wouldn't want to be a biocentrist at all, right? Then an ecocentrist, for example, wants to remove invasive species, right? Whereas the biocentrist has no moral basis to say that an invasive species is morally worse than a native species. So, anyway, keep that in mind. The biocentrists are skeptical of the metaphysical commitments that the holists make, that the ecocentrists make, and of course, many people are skeptical of both, right? They think the biocentrists are metaphysically out to lunch and just overcommitted, way too far, and then many people, of course, would say the same thing about the Leopoldians and all the ecocentrists. They're just overcommitted metaphysically. It's all just new agey hippie stuff, right? And that's how, when you encounter these moral struggles, that's how the developer side, they just slam the door, right? They reach out, they reach into their bag of tricks, and they pull out Baxter's point of view, and right? And which is the same as Wilson's point of view in a way, right? That it's only humans. Humans are the only ones. And so that slams the door on both biocentrism and it slams the door on ecocentrism, right? It's all hippy-dippy, heavy-duty metaphysical commitments. To hell with it all. All right. But just keep in mind that those who say to hell with all metaphysical commitments might also yank the rug right out from underneath the feet of our great humanistic society. Because our commitments to respecting human rights around the world are also on slippery and squishy and unproven and scientifically unverifiable terrain. Okay? So beware, of condemning the notion that some entities have moral status. Independent moral status, because at some point that same view, that same skepticism of moral status could be turned around on the human being, because our humanitarian system of respect for human rights is based on a story that can't be proven, right? What would it even mean to prove it? Okay, so This point, I like to remind students, that there's always this point lurking out there. Respect for the rights of ecological wholes is symmetrical in the sense that they're both stories, right? And if you want to challenge the story that says we have responsibilities for ecological wholes, then you need to be careful that you don't throw everything out and end up challenging the whole idea that we have duties at all, right? Right? I mean, at some point you might just end up agreeing with the genetic harvest of a person who has valuable right, because if it saves 10,000 people, right? You see what I'm saying? Right? I mean, if you want to be rescued from the nihilism that utilitarianism leads us toward, then you're going to need to accept some kind of story about universal human rights, right? And that's a story, and it can't be scientifically proven. And so it's going to be shaky. Anyway, so shakiness is not just an attribute of the notion that forests have rights. It's also an attribute of the notion that humans have rights. No, there's that word autopoietic for those of you who want to spell it right. I really like that word. It's kind of a new word. Right? But this is comparing respect for human rights with respect for the rights of ecological wholes, right? They have these generic features of a narrative, these generic narrative features, right? They're not, none of this stuff is scientifically provable. All right, let's take a break. All right, let's come back in about 3 or 4 minutes, and then we'll get right into more into environmental pragmatism. I know the one we're supposed to turn in today? Yeah. Well, so what are we going to do?
I was going to ask you.
Oh, yeah. I have, you didn't pick up your work on Tuesdays, and it's still here, mostly in yes, I believe it's all in alphabetical order. There were reading summaries from last week, and there are midterms still in there.
I was reading about this, in Australia they're trying to eliminate this one fish by using, by releasing arteries in the water.
The fish, I read that too, yeah, what fish?
Carp, right?
The carp, yeah.
I was like, kind of strange way to go up on killing that thing.
Yes. No, yeah, next week's summary is on Birch, that's right. Are you? Yeah, I know, yeah. Yeah, but obviously I just want you to summarize the whole thing. Are you Bethany?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Just running around.
Oh, I'm sorry, okay. Here, I think that's, yeah, that's today's crash, right? Right at the very top.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's out there, it's out there. If it's not there, then something happened and we'll fix it.
You said that Mulier was basically unnecessarily opposite, like his argument in Newton verification. So is that the opposite from that natural law argument?
No, it's not opposite. It's better to say it's opposite from a Wilson, from a subjectivist utilitarian argument.
Okay.
It has more in common with the natural law argument, but it's a deontological argument. But we should be skeptical about it.
Okay, I mean, in the summary I said that like it's similar to natural law.
It is. That's a very good point. Of course.
Okay.
The difference, as far as the best I can characterize it, the natural law argument copies moral norms directly from nature, whereas the deontological argument only uses an analysis of nature to make the claim that this ecological whole has in itself metaphysical status. Okay? So they're not borrowing a norm from nature. Okay? They're saying nature has certain things in nature have this status, and our norm is we can't rationally instrumentalize things that have this status. That's our norm. Okay? But that's not borrowed from nature. That's something we've adopted through culture. Anyway, but Rolston's account of that's something that maybe confuses some people. Rolston would agree that you need a human culture for institutions to be built up that protect and respect intrinsic values. But he thinks that culture, that science science is developed enough that it's disclosing the truth about nature. Anyway, all right, let's get back into this. I think I want to try to get through as much of this as I can on this material on environmental pragmatism, because we're going to be dealing with environmental pragmatism. So you can file environmental pragmatism as an example of a comprehensive, integrated environmental ethic. And that's distinctly different from neo-Kantian ecocentrism, and that's also distinctly different from neo-Humean ecocentrism. All right. So just to review, I don't know how we've reviewed this stuff so many times already, but these are our three varieties of consequentialist ethic. We didn't really spend any time thinking about egocentrism at all, right? But that's always kind of lurking there. It's a coherent theory, so we need to acknowledge it. That is their measurement of right and wrong resource policy is just whatever satisfies my preferences, right? Utilitarianism is kind of like a group egoism, egocentric, like a group collective, right? Everyone has to be taken into account now, not just one person. But it's still all about pleasure and happiness, preference, satisfaction, and happiness, right? Conservationism could be interpreted as a form of rural utilitarianism. Now notice that the different kinds of holistic consequentialism that we look at, they all share a common ancestry. And the pragmatist thinkers share the same philosophical lineage. David Hume, Adam Smith, Darwin, as I mentioned. William James dedicated one of his books to the great neo-Humean, the utilitarian, John Stuart Mill. These guys, so interestingly enough, Collicutt and the environmental pragmatists identified as coming from the same philosophical ancestry, okay? Empiricism, right? Scottish Enlightenment thinkers, not rationalism, not German Enlightenment thinkers, right? Rolston identifies with the German Enlightenment tradition, the tradition of rationalism. But these guys all come out of the same lineage, all right? And so then